כדי להעשיר את הדברים שלנו. וההרצאה הזאת, כפי שאתם רואים, עוסקת בשאלות של ציונות, ישראל, הודו, פקיסטן. היא תינתן על ידי רפאל שטרן, דוקטורנט, השנה שלישית, במחלקה להיסטוריה בהרווארד, מתעניין בהיסטוריה של המשפט, היסטוריה של המזרח התיכון, ישראל, יהדות. הוא בעל MA מהרווארד ומפרינסטון, BA מברנדייס, וכל זה מוביל לדוקטורט, ונשמע משהו מהדוקטורט שבדרך.
אז אני הולך לדבר באנגלית, אבל אני מוכן, או אני שמח לענות לתשובות בעברית. As the 1948 war escalated from a Jewish-Palestinian civil war to a regional and interstate conflict, Zionists and following independence, Israelis looked toward South Asia. 9 months earlier, the partition of British India had resulted in the formation of Pakistan and India.
יש מעט זמן, אנחנו לא נבין אותך, אז הפסקנו לגמרי, אז קצת לאט.
Okay. While Zionists cum Israelis were first and foremost concerned with their own escalating war, their efforts to consolidate their state structures and to navigate the international terrain, their own efforts to consolidate their state structures and to navigate the international terrain made increasingly apparent how similar and different they were to India and Pakistan. Yet the exact nature of their commonality was quite equivocal. As this paper seeks to show, at times they saw and portrayed themselves as more akin to Indians. At others, they identified Zionism and Israel as paralleling Pakistan. Whether India or Pakistan was the doppelganger of the Jewish state was never very clear. This paper attempts to flesh out the different comparisons and connections that Israeli politicians and officials drew with India and Pakistan respectively, and in turn to demonstrate the international thinking of Israelis in the period surrounding 1948 and how this informed the construction of nascent state institutions. I've structured the paper as follows. I'll first discuss Israeli-Indian connections and comparisons. Then I'll turn to Israeli-Pakistani connections. Here I'll foreground the idea of population transfer and the Israeli transplantation of Pakistani evacuee property legislation. I'll end by talking about historiographic contributions of this project to Israeli history and especially legal history. So, Israel-India. There were several connections between Palestine and India in the first half of the 20th century. On the Jewish and Zionist level, efforts to draw contemporary similarities augmented repeated Zionist discussions of long-standing cultural and religious connections between Judaism and Hinduism. Eugene Hoflich, an enigmatic publicist who sought to fashion Zionism into part of a pan-Semitic movement, drew inspiration from Rabindranath Tagore. Martin Buber and Chaim Greenberg both had a series of exchanges with Gandhi over the course of the 1930s. Emanuel Ostwanger, a scholar of Sanskrit and a member of Brit Shalom, met with Gandhi and Nehru in 1936. From ancient times to the present, these individuals and others asserted, India and Israel were partners. The anticipated geopolitical realignments in the wake of World War II served as the primary impetus for increased Zionist intrigue with India in the late 1940s. A Zionist delegation participated in the 1947 Asian Relations Conference held in New Delhi. The delegation included academics such as Hugo Bergman and Alfred Bonner. Alfred Bonner was an economist and a member of the מכון לחקר הכלכלה של הסוכנות היהודית. Olsvanger, the diplomat David Cohen, and the journalist and Cohen's wife, Bracha Chabas. In interactions with Indian figures, Zionists cast Zionism as part of, quote, the awakening Asia. In a 1949 meeting with Nehru, Eliyahu Eilat, formerly Epstein, who was at the time the ambassador to Washington and will figure later in the story, stressed that Zionism, with the caveat of its past European linkages, was at its core part of Asia. Quote, לא רק יסודות התרבות שלנו מקורם בארץ ישראל, אלא שהציונות היא חלק בלתי נפרד מתנועות התחייה הלאומיות של עמי אסיה. אף כי תולדות הציונות כתנועה מדינית קשורים יותר במערב. שאיפותינו להשתתף השתתפות פעילה בחיי היבשת שבה אנו יושבים, ולתרום את חלקנו לקידומה של אסיה והעמים הרבים. End quote. Zionists also saw their struggle against British mandatory authorities as similar to those of Indians. Chabas stressed the similarities between the Indian Black Sunday, that's August 9, 1942, and the Zionist Black Sabbath, June 29, 1946. Interestingly, this parallel was initially drawn out by an Indian reporter of The Hindu. Numerous Zionist newspapers spoke of Indian soldiers in Palestine and portrayed the Yishuv in India as engaged in the struggle for freedom against fascism. Likewise, in Israeli coverage of the unfolding conflict in Kashmir, there were multiple comparisons between the Pakistani invasion of Kashmir and the Arab invasion of Palestine, including discussions of British involvement in both the Pakistani military and in the Jordanian Arab Legion forces. Zionist diplomatic overtures in the 1940s were also defined by efforts at persuading Indians of the difference between Zionist national aspirations and those of the proponents of Pakistan. In conversations with Indian historian and politician K.M. Panikar in April 1947, Alfred Bona emphasized that partition in Palestine would result in relative ethnic homogeneity, whereas that in South Asia would not. While not discounting the underlying ethnic and separatist agendas of both proponents of Zionism in Pakistan, Bona stressed the practical and territorial differences between these projects. Also featuring in Israeli efforts to garner Indian support was the notion of a shared Muslim antagonist. As Pakistan attempted, rather unsuccessfully, to woo Arab states, Israeli politicians and diplomats used this to portray Israel and India as engaged in a shared struggle against Muslim entities. The India-based Zionist journal, India and Israel, according to one astute observer, quote, attempts to take advantage, in German, zu benutzen versucht, the opposition between us, that is Zionism and Israel, and between Islam and the Arabs, to promote a connection between Zionism and India, end quote. Indeed, this latter argument gained traction among a subsection of Indian nationalists, and specifically Bengalis. Taraknath Das emphasized the Islamic dimension of the Zionist Arab and Indian Pakistani conflicts. Himunta Kumar Tarafdar, who asserted that Jews constituted a quote-unquote race, and therefore, in accordance with the, quote, basic principles of the Atlantic Charter, end quote, had a claim to national self-determination in Palestine, also emphasized the alleged common pan-Islamist foe. In the aftermath of partition, the heavily influential historian, the Bengali historian, Jagannath Sarkar, positively evoked Zionism as a model for West Bengali refugees, while contrasting it to a backward Islamic environment. Quote, Eastern Bengal is going the way of Palestine without the Jews. We must make our Western Bengal what Palestine under Jewish rule will be, a light in darkness, an oasis of civilization in the desert of medieval ignorance and obsolete theocratic bigotry, end quote. These efforts to align with India on the international level and convince Indians of the difference between Zionist and Pakistani inspirations were, at least in diplomatic terms, not very successful, however. The unwillingness of the INC, that's the Indian National Congress, leadership to embrace Zionist stances was apparent in 1947 when it took an especially prominent role in opposing the UN partition plan for Palestine and instead promoted federalism. In 1955, India, under Arab and Pakistani pressure, did not invite Israel to the Bandung Conference. Yet in spite of, or perhaps because of the cold shoulder that they received, the Zionists doubled down in their effort to establish relations with Indians. As part of these efforts, Zionists embraced connections with Indians on the level of expertise. As early as 1946, Indian economic and agricultural experts came to Palestine to study the cooperative farming movement. Academic exchanges were set up between the Hebrew University and Indian universities. And the Histadrut's Afro-Asian Institute was an important site for Israeli-Indian connections. Importantly, expertise, whether legal or social scientific, also played a central role in linkages between Zionism and Pakistan, to which I will now turn. At times, the Zionism-India comparison was rejected in favor of a comparison between Zionism and Pakistan. In a March 1946 conversation with British Member of Parliament, British Member of Parliament and President of the World Jewish Congress's British section, Cindy Silverman, Gandhi equated Zionism in Pakistan, even recommending that Silverman meet with Jinnah for political and diplomatic support. Many Arab politicians understood that they cannot, quote, support partition in India, i.e. support the Muslim League, and be against in the Nile Valley and Palestine, i.e. support Zionist support for partition, end quote. While most representatives of the Muslim League and later Pakistan explicitly rejected this equation of support for partition in South Asia and Palestine, such as when Mohammad Zafrullah Khan did so at the UN in October 1947, Jinnah himself compared Indian Muslim situations as minorities to that of world Jewry, and thereby insinuated that Pakistan was emulating Zionism. Zionists also looked to Pakistan. Both before and after 1948, there were a handful of contacts between Zionists and Pakistanis. Beyond this, Zionists often viewed discussions of Pakistan as a gauge for international reactions to developments in Palestine. In March 1944, Uriel Haid, a German-born Zionist and Orientalist, drew an equivalence between Zionism and proponents of Pakistan. For the two, quote, there is one shared fundamental question. Within one state, there are two community nations running around, which differ in their religion, culture, social lives, with one majority and the other a minority, end quote. Likewise, F.W. Pollack, the editor of India and Israel, entertained the possibility of Zionist alliances with both the INC and the Muslim League. Throughout its first years, the Zionist Orientalist journal, Hamizrach HaChadash, also routinely covered developments in Pakistan even when it was silent on India. The most substantive connection and the one with the most long-standing impact was the Israeli transplantation of Pakistani law in the construction of its policies towards Palestinian refugees and properties. This has initially been covered by Alexander Kedar, and I hope to expand on that. Now, before proceeding, I just want to make a few comments about population transfer more generally. First, thinking about population transfer was by no means a uniquely Zionist enterprise. The earliest expressions in support of modern state-organized population transfer and exchange seem to have come about prior to and during World War I. Exchanges and transfers were then carried out in the 1913 Turkish-Bulgarian Convention. They were retroactively agreed upon in the 1923 Lausanne Agreement between Turkey and Greece. There were an array of proposals and realized plans for transfer in interwar and World War II era Eastern Europe. Subsequent proponents of population transfer, all of whom unproblematically reference the Greek-Turkish exchange, included Edward Benesch, Herbert Hoover, Sumner Wells, and South Asians such as Syed Abdul Latif, Tara Singh, Jinnah in some vague and controversial statements, and B.R. Ambedkar. While Zionism was predicated on the transfer of Jews out of Europe, Zionists became especially interested in transferring Arabs out of Palestine after the 1937 Peel Commission suggested as part of the partition. Second, there were two general strands of thinking underlying population transfer. One strand emerged as a quote-unquote solution to multi-ethnic states. As Mark Mazauer argues, the interwar and post-World War II debates regarding minority questions centered on whether they could be solved through international law in the form of minority treaties or through a territorialist solution entailing population transfer. The second strand, and which I believe has received less attention, was an intersecting social, scientific, and demographic discourse regarding global population distribution. This latter current was especially important in discussions regarding the colonial world. While it would be facile to cast these two bodies of experts as completely unconnected, it's fair to state that their interests differed and at times even conflicted. In contrast to diplomats and politicians who were concerned with ethnic homogeneity within their borders, demographers were often internationalists and opposed to the continued disproportionate distribution of land and resources accompanying European colonialism. Warren Thompson, Robert Kuczynski, Radhikama Mukherjee, and Taraknath Das supported wide-scale population redistribution of Europeans, colonial subjects, and non-Europeans to quote-unquote empty parts of the world. Among Zionists, there were also a range of demographers and economists who studied the Arab Middle East and at various points in time promoted the transfer of Palestinians from Palestine to quote-unquote underpopulated and underdeveloped, end quote, areas in the region, including Iraq, Syria, and parts of Transjordan. These included members of Brit Shalom, who, given their support for a broader Palestinian and regional federation, viewed the Middle East as a connected space in which population density could be adjusted through transfer. So there's no doubt that Benny Morris is correct in stating that by 1948, quote, population transfer was in the air, end quote. What's important to note is that this statement holds true on a global level. Third and finally, discussions of the Israeli transplantation of Pakistani law only began with the official creation of the Transfer Committee on August 29, 1948. As Morris discusses, the committee had earlier semi-official iterations, but only received an explicit letter of appointment from Ben Gurion in late August, that is, following the expulsion or exodus of most Palestinians. Moshe Sharet, who was at the time the foreign minister, initiated the Transfer Committee and set out its objectives as undertaking, among other things, quote, collection of information about the wandering, flight, or expulsion of other populations around the world, including Greece and Turkey, Pakistan and Hindustan. He also set out that the goal was formulating plans for the resettlement of refugees in the Arab states and the appointment of a quote-unquote team of workers to carry out this aforementioned work. The committee was officially composed of Ezra Dani and Zalman Lifshitz and Yosef Weitz. Eliyahu Epstein and Joseph Shechtman, both of whom were in the U.S. at the time and were not technically on the committee, were, however, central in bringing the legal aftermath of South Asian partition to Israel. Epstein was born in Ukraine, immigrated to Palestine, studied at the American University in Beirut, and was an Arabist. In 1943, Epstein began to take an interest in India. He developed a relationship with Taraknath Das and contacted the Zionist F.W. Pollock, who was based in India. In 1947, he played a role in getting the Yishuv invited to the Asian Relations Conference. At the time that the Transfer Committee operated, he was serving as the first Israeli diplomat to Washington. Though also born in Ukraine, Shechtman had a rather different biography. A lawyer by training and a journalist by practice, he was a key revisionist Zionist and the personal secretary of Vladimir Jabotinsky. In the 1930s, he became heavily interested in population transfers, and in 1939 published a volume on different proposals concerning Jewish immigration and determined that Palestine was the only viable option. After emigrating to New York in 1941 and working in the U.S.'s OSS, he published in 1946 a comprehensive survey of World War II-era population transfers, primarily conducted by the Nazis and the Soviets in Europe. By 1948-1949, Shechtman was a preeminent scholar and supporter of population transfers. His works, including population transfers in Asia, are still cited today. While Shechtman was writing Population Transfers in Asia, which argued that the population displacement in South Asia should be recognized as quote-unquote a population exchange, and that a similar exchange involving Palestinian Arabs and Jews in Arab states should be executed, he was recruited to the Israeli governmental efforts to effect a solution of its liking to its demographic predicaments in the Middle East in the wake of Israel's creation in the 1948 war. In late 1948-1949, Shechtman sent along news details regarding the expulsion of Volksdeutsche in Europe. The primary legal and legislative materials were from Pakistan and to a lesser extent India, however. On the practical level, the Transfer Committee looked to Pakistan for an example of how to deal with and ultimately confiscate refugee property. But there are additional reasons for giving the specific attention to Pakistan. First, the other contemporary examples of transfer seem to have been rather unattractive. Though they spoke about the similarities amongst each other, no one in the Transfer Committee wanted to publicly identify the situation of Palestinians with that of World War II and post-war refugees. To this end, Shechtman stressed that the population transfer has a much nobler lineage, that's his quote from him, that precedes Nazi Germany and population transfers. As part of this alternative lineage, India and Pakistan offered a much more suitable parallel reality. Second, from a pure legal and technical perspective, and in line with Kedar's claim, Indian and Pakistani legislation was particularly appropriate for this new focus, given that both it and the Israeli legal system derived from British colonial law. That both legal systems included recent and extremely powerful British emergency legislation that allowed for the confiscation of enemy property and placement under a custodian significantly eased the appropriation of specific pieces of legislation. For other reasons too, Pakistan, as opposed to India, was especially attractive. First, the Transfer Committee was drawn to Pakistani legislation specifically because Pakistan was Muslim, and at least according to the crystallizing public stance of Israelis, it was in line with Arabs and opposed to Israel. The committee determined that Pakistani legislation was especially useful given, quote-unquote, quote, A, the date of the ordinance, October 1948, B, the ordinance relates to problems that are similar to the birth pangs of Israel, just in emphasized a Muslim country, and C, that this state belongs to, again emphasized, the British Commonwealth and the UN, great advantages that make it a first-rate international precedent that we must hurry and use with no hesitation. One of the benefits is this statement also applies to all of Pakistan. Third, in a different vein from this notion of an underlying religious difference between Israel and Pakistan, it followed that there were also similarities between the two. In line with Faisal Devji's work, both sought to create states in which a previous minority population, Jews in Mandate Palestine and Muslims in colonial India, were rendered majorities. This ultimately set in motion a process in which Pollock, the Zionist in India, sent Shechtman Pakistani ordinances, including two ordinances promulgated on October 18, 1948, intended to regulate the protection and care of property of evacuees from Pakistan, Ordinance 18, and to provide for the restoration and maintenance of the economic life of Pakistan and the orderly settlement of people who have taken refuge therein, Ordinance 19. As Zamindar argues, Ordinance 18 established a distinct legal category of the evacuee, as opposed to the refugee, placed evacuee property under the custodian, and extended previous regional legislation to the entirety of Pakistan. This was also part of an escalating tit-for-tat Pakistani and Indian legislative war for control of refugee property. After receiving this legislation, the Israeli Transfer Committee adapted it to replace the existing patchwork British World War II-era legislation under which they'd been operating. The British legislation granted only temporary control of property of foreigners that was deemed to be of potential value to the enemy. The Israeli adaptation of the Pakistani law allowed the government to establish a new custodian and ultimately permanently expropriate these properties. Now, there's this whole process in which the committee brings it up to the Knesset, and actually they initially invoke Pakistan, but then they understand that this is problematic in the Israeli perception, so they try to kind of hide that fact. But what's important is that by the end of the day, by March 14th, 1950, this law is enshrined as the 1950 Absentees Property Law, and there's similar legislation for the Development Authority, which is passed on July 31st, 1950, as the 1950 Development Authority Transfer of Property Law. Now, I just want to mention one historiographic contribution, and I think this paper goes to contextualize Israeli history, and especially legal history, within the global process of state formation after World War II in both Europe and the post-colonial world. The focus on Israeli transplantation of Pakistani law underscored their shared British legal legacies. Without rehashing the long-standing debate regarding the relationship between Zionism, the Yishuv, and colonialism, it can be said that the State of Israel emerged with the end of British Mandate Palestine and is part of the broader dissolution of British Empire. Viewing Israel in relation to what we now term decolonization can direct our attention to Israel's relationship with other nascent post-colonial states. To be sure, I'm not arguing that Israel squarely fits into these histories. Yet by situating Israel in relation to other post-colonial states, we can look at how they influenced one another, and in this case, how law traveled across post-colonies. In contrast to the significant literature on legal transplantations across the British Empire, in which, as Thomas Metcalfe and others have shown, British India was a major point of origin of many colonial laws, less attention has been given to transplantation among post-colonies. Even as many of these states operated to dispossess, seclude, and enshrine the bifurcation of empire into nation-states, the transplantation of law nonetheless points to connectivity. Separation and seclusion did not emerge on their own, but rather entailed connections that now seem surprising given geopolitical realities, and this holds true for legal connections and parallel developments between Israel and other post-colonial Middle Eastern states.